There are wounds that can't be seen with the naked eye. No blood, no scream. Yet they ache endlessly inside, through sleepless nights, mornings that feel empty, and silent moments where your heart feels hollow even in a crowd. We often endure in silence, masters at hiding it, trying to move on, as if that's just how life works. But then, one day, a melody plays a wordless tune, a lyric that seems random, and suddenly, something inside breaks open. Not because music heals instantly, but because it speaks the pain we never knew how to name. Maybe it's the loneliness we never dared to admit, the childhood wound we thought we'd forgotten, the dream that fell apart mid-journey, the constant sense of being not enough, undeserving, or unloved, buried so deep inside. Music doesn't tell us how to live right. It doesn't tell us to be strong. It doesn't judge. Music simply stays with us, like a friend who listens without offering advice. And in that moment, when melody syncs with heartbeat, when tears fall for no reason, we feel lighter. Lighter, as if someone, finally, understands the ache we've carried for so long. This story is for you, the one who has endured in silence, the one who still carries wounds, the one who believes music, even if it can't save us from this world, can keep our hearts intact enough to keep walking forward. Music that heals the wounds within. Perhaps in this life, everyone will experience days when they feel sad for no clear reason. Nothing has happened, no tragedy, no one hurt you, and no obvious cause for the tears that fall. Yet your heart feels empty. Your chest feels as though something is squeezing it. And every passing minute becomes a quiet battle. Have you ever felt that way? Afternoons where no one calls your name. Nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the dreams you once held have quietly slipped away. Mornings where you don't want to open your eyes, not because you're tired, but because there's nothing to look forward to anymore. We often call it exhaustion, stress, a rough patch, but in truth, it is when the soul is quietly bleeding and we don't even realize it. Because wounds of the heart don't show on the surface, others can't see them, and even we learn to ignore them, as if, with more effort and strength, they'll simply go away. But some wounds don't heal with time. They lie buried, beneath layers of busyness, under the many roles we pretend to be. And then one day, we randomly play a piece of music. Just the first notes begin, and our heart tightens. A lyric is sung, and tears fall, for reasons we can't explain. It's not that the music says anything extraordinary. It's that it touches the exact place in our hearts that has been silently aching. Music has never been just entertainment. For those who carry wounds, music is like a warm breath gently placed on a trembling heart. It doesn't ask questions, doesn't try to fix us, doesn't demand we become better. It simply stays, like a quiet friend. An instrumental piece can reach the deepest corners of the soul, places words, logic, or advice cannot reach. Because music doesn't ask to be explained. It simply listens to the pain through its own melody. And maybe, just maybe, you've had a moment like that too. Maybe it was a song that played right after you lost someone. Maybe it was a tune that found you while sitting in a hospital hallway. Maybe it was piano notes echoing in your room after a heartbreak. Or maybe it was a melody that appeared when you thought you had healed, but it revealed the wound still lingering within. The story we are about to hear today does not have a clear ending. There's no miracle, no hero, just a person, like you, like me, carrying unnamed scars. And in the journey of walking through their pain, they discovered something unexpectedly gentle. Music may not heal us instantly, but it gives us a place to pause, to breathe, and to no longer feel alone. If you've ever felt pain without knowing why, if you've ever survived days you thought you wouldn't make it through, if there's still a part of you quietly asking to be held, then listen to this story. Not to learn how to live, but to remember, some wounds don't need a reason to exist, and some melodies don't need words to heal. Part 1. When music listens in silence. Elara wasn't the kind of person who talked about her sadness. She lived independently, worked diligently, and always offered a polite smile when someone asked, "Are you doing okay?" As if being okay was a task to be completed, not a feeling to be experienced. She was in her 30s, living alone in a quiet apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her office job was stable, with little drama, but it never truly made her feel alive. Her relationships were cordial, enough to avoid loneliness. but never deep enough for anyone to notice the emptiness in her eyes after a long day. She couldn't remember the last time she really cried, or the last moment joy made her want to dance. She wasn't in obvious pain. There was no dramatic trauma, just a subtle exhaustion, as if her soul had been on mute for too long, and she could no longer hear it herself. Until one rainy evening. On the train ride home, Elara mindlessly pressed play. Not to relax, not out of love for music, just a habit, like every other night. The city lights smeared across the train window in quiet motion. Then a piano piece began to play. No lyrics, no climax, just bare, gentle notes falling like the raindrops outside. Solitary, soft, fragile. She never learned the title, never knew the composer. But in a few seconds, something inside her broke open. Tears welled up, unstoppable. The music didn't tell her what to feel. It didn't offer advice or comfort. It simply existed, like a quiet friend who sat beside her, saying nothing, rushing nothing, just listening. That night, when she got home, Elara didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark, earbuds still in, and replayed the same piece. Then another, and another. Not sad songs, not cliché healing tracks, just honest sounds, like pages from a wordless diary. Gradually, Elara began to build her own playlist, not based on trends or themes, but on feelings. Each song brought back a memory, a childhood afternoon playing in faded sunlight, a long-lost friendship. No bitterness, just the slow drift of time, or a silent night outside a hospital corridor, praying for someone behind a white door. She realized she didn't need someone to fix her. She just needed space to feel. And in a quiet, unexplainable way, music gave her that. No judgment, no expectations, no answers, only sound, entering the cracks where no words had ever reached. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Music didn't embrace me, but it taught me how to embrace myself." Part 2. The songs that never waited for names. From that day on, Elara began to live differently, not in loud or dramatic ways, but as if something had gently fallen away, like dust being quietly wiped off a forgotten surface. She still went to work as usual, met people, fulfilled her responsibilities. But after each long day, instead of letting her mind spiral with unanswerable questions, she chose to sit down, press play, and simply do nothing. She called these moments her silent space. Not quite meditation, not really prayer, just listening. Listening to songs no one selected for her, not curated for healing, not trending, just melodies that knocked at the door of her heart at the right time. Some pieces brought her back to childhood memories, where cicadas and the whir of an old fan blended into summer afternoons. Some felt like unspoken farewells to people she once held close, and some, curiously, evoked nothing at all, like water quietly flowing through her mind, weightless, soft, asking for nothing. Elara began to understand. Not every pain needs to be unraveled or explained. Some wounds don't ask for comfort, only for a sound real enough to sit beside them. One evening, she played a 10-minute cello piece. At first, it felt too slow, but gradually, each warm, resonant note seemed to breathe for her. She stopped trying to understand, stopped naming emotions. All she knew was, in that moment, something inside her felt light. Light. Like she didn't have to hold everything together anymore. Music didn't transform Elara's life. It didn't turn her into someone new. But it helped her be honest with herself, without fear of judgment. It didn't soothe her with promises like everything will be fine, but stayed with her in silence, as if saying, even if it's not fine, that's okay too. And when she no longer felt forced to be okay, Elara noticed her mind slowly uncoiling. Like realizing you don't need to fix a clock that's running behind. Just listening to its quiet ticking is enough to remember it's still alive in its own time. Through music, Elara learned this. Healing doesn't come from finding answers, but from allowing ourselves to feel fully, without censorship, without haste. And sometimes, that begins with nothing more than a single note. Part 3. The voice within the wordless songs. One quiet Sunday morning, Elara woke earlier than usual. The sky was still wrapped in a soft mist. The sunlight had not yet arrived. But she was already awake, pouring herself a warm cup of tea and gently pressing play on her familiar playlist. Not to fill the silence, but as a way of saying hello. She no longer listened to music as a form of escape. It wasn't to drown out silence anymore. Now, music had become a rhythm within her life. Each melody, a gentle step she took to walk beside herself. That morning, she realized something quietly profound. There were tracks she had always skipped, too strange, too unfamiliar, or not in the mood. But today, she chose one of them. And to her surprise, she found herself within it. No lyrics, no crescendo, just a few notes echoing and fading. Yet in those tones, she heard something unmistakable. Herself as a child in the kitchen, the clinking of chopsticks on porcelain, the yellow kitchen light, and her mother's soft cough behind her. She understood then. Music doesn't need to be understood right away. Just like our emotions, they don't need to be defined or explained. They only ask to be heard. In the months that followed, Elara began to write down what she heard from each song. Not technical notes, but emotions, fragments of images, blurred memories, old sadness, or sudden bursts of light. These journal pages were not polished or poetic, but they were honest. And that honesty, to her, was more valuable than any expensive therapy. One rainy afternoon, she came across a young girl crying alone on the train station steps. Elara didn't ask questions. She didn't offer comfort. She simply sat beside her and shared one side of her headphones. Just music. The two of them sat in silence for 10 minutes. But when the music stopped, the girl gave a small smile, faint but real. Elara smiled back. She wasn't anyone important. Not a therapist. Not a motivational figure. She was simply someone who once knew pain and had someone, maybe unseen, sit quietly beside her through a song. Years later, Elara no longer tried to fix herself. She no longer needed to name her sadness. Because some days, instead of asking, "Why do I feel like this?" she simply played a song and let her soul answer. And that, she realized, is how healing happens. Not by seeking something outside, but by listening to the sound within, the one that has always been there, waiting for us to be quiet enough to hear it. Part 4. The sound within the silence. Time passed, and Elara no longer kept track of how many songs she listened to each day. She no longer wrote down her feelings after every track. Not because she was completely healed, but because she had stopped asking whether she was healed at all. One late afternoon, she sat alone in her small room, bathed in golden sunset light. There was no music, no melody playing in the background. Yet in that silence, she felt something that resembled music, a presence without words. A kind of sound that no device could record, but those who truly listened could sense. She remembered being a shy little girl, hiding in the back shed to escape the shouting of grown-ups. There was no music, no comforting words, but something in that darkness kept her grounded. And now she understood, that moment might have been the beginning. The first time her heart learned that to endure silence is also a kind of music. Since then, she had started to observe more deeply. Once, at a quiet cafe, she heard a soft jazz tune filling the space. She noticed an elderly man at the next table, silver-haired, eyes gently closed, fingers tapping lightly on the tabletop. No words were exchanged, yet there was a silent connection between them, not through speech, but through shared feeling in the music. Elara realized then, music no longer lived inside her headphones. It lived in her attention, in the moments people paused to feel life, even just for a breath. She began experimenting with silence. On certain evenings, she didn't play music. Instead, she sat on the floor, closed her eyes, and simply listened to the silence within. Some nights, the silence was loud, like wind echoing through an empty room. But over time, it softened. Not because anything outside changed, but because she had stopped resisting. Healing is not about silencing the noise in your head. It's about learning to sit quietly with it. Until one day, you realize the noise itself is also just another kind of sound, and then it fades on its own. Part 5. When a song becomes light. That spring, Elara decided to leave the city. Not to escape, but because she felt it was time to live closer to nature, where there were no honking horns, no crowded calendars, no social media constantly urging her to be better. She moved to a small mountain town. There, the mornings were quiet. Only the wind slipping through the cracks in the windows, birds chirping to the sun, and sometimes the sound of her own heartbeat, slow but steady, as if whispering, "I'm still here." One day, A neighborhood child knocked on her door, holding a small recorder in his hand. "I hear my mom cry every night," he said. "Do you have a song that can fix that?" The question didn't sadden Elara. Instead, it made her smile, a soft, tender smile like a newborn leaf. She understood now, we're not here to fix others. But when we've walked through our own pain, we can offer a small light to someone still lost in theirs. She handed him her headphones and played the same instrumental track that once held her through her darkest nights. A song with no words, no climax, but just enough to cradle a tired heart. From that day forward, Elara began sharing her playlist. Not as an expert, not as a guru, but simply as someone who once wandered through the ruins of her own soul and found, in music, a way back. No one knew her name. Few remembered her face. But the melodies she left behind quietly drifted into other lives, nameless, gentle, enough to help someone stop crying on a sorrowful night. Music is not a solution. It doesn't erase pain. But sometimes, it becomes the silent arms that hold our souls when the world turns away. And in the moment we think we are alone, perhaps, somewhere, a melody has already begun to play. Not to say everything will be fine, but just to remind us, you are not alone. Elara's story had no dramatic climax, no miracle, and no triumphant ending. And yet, that's exactly why it resonates, because it mirrors the quiet reality of so many people's lives, souls silently enduring, hearts that seem unable to hear anything but the sound of their own breaking. In this story, music isn't just entertainment. It becomes a silent teacher, saying nothing, but always present. It doesn't preach philosophy, nor does it demand change, yet it finds its way into places within us that words cannot reach. The song Elara once listened to in despair didn't promise her that everything would be okay, nor did it judge her for being broken. It simply remained, like a friend who refuses to leave. And sometimes, that's all we need. Through Elara's journey, we are reminded of a quiet truth we often forget. Healing doesn't begin with eliminating pain, but with the courage to sit down beside it, the way we listen to a sad melody without skipping any part. In a world of constant noise, where voices pull us in every direction, music, especially the silence between its notes, becomes a sacred space where we return to ourselves. It teaches us about presence, about feeling each breath, each heartbeat, like a forgotten symphony gently awakening within. And perhaps, the most meaningful lesson Elara leaves us with doesn't lie in the song she listened to, but in the life she chose to live afterward. Sharing not to rescue others, but simply to remind them that even in their most hopeless moments, there is a gentle sound waiting to be heard. Pause. Listen. The music that heals you may not come from a grand stage, but from the soft breath of stillness. And when we learn to truly hear ourselves, we, too, become a quiet melody in someone else's life.